research isn't misleading me, apparently during Hinckley's trial for the assassination attempt, the court was told that in February 1981, he'd actually stood outside the Dakota building on the spot where John Lennon had been shot, and he had a gun in his pocket, and he wanted to, and I quote unquote, he wanted to destroy himself. I've actually got the report here. I've taken a photocopy of it. I've got it on paper here. And according to mainstream news reports, in May 1981, shortly after the attempt on Reagan's life, so yeah, it was mid-1981, law officials had revealed after interviews with Hinckley that he was, and I quote, obsessed with the death of John Lennon and in his mind binded together the slain Beatles star and Jodie Foster. He was quoted as saying, "My life is screwed up. The world is even more screwed up. I don't know why people want to live. John Lennon is dead. I still think about Jodie all the time. That's all I think about, really. That and John Lennon's death. They were sort of binded together. They were sort of binded together before December the 8th. They've been binded together since last summer, really. John and Jodie have been binded together with me, and now one of them's dead." And when they investigated Hinckley's hotel room, they reportedly found a number of books, and one of those books was about John Lennon, and the other one was of course The Catcher in the Rye, which is the so-called, as researchers have pointed out, it was possibly the trigger book for Mark David Chapman as well. It was the book that was found when the police arrived at the Dakota after Lennon had been shot, and Mark David Chapman standing there. That's what he's reading. And of course, he later said, and he still says, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he does keep saying that this book was, he wanted to become the character in the book, Holden Caulfield, right, who saw everybody as a phony. That this is a book. It's not a disturbing book. I mean, you'd think if you hadn't read it, it would be a disturbing book, seeing as it seems to be a trigger for all these, assassins or would-be assassins. But if you actually read the book, it's basically a story about a 15, 16-year-old, upper middle class, maybe higher than that, student who's at boarding school in America, and he just sees everybody as phonies, as superficial. Like, for example, he'll go and watch a movie in a cinema, in a movie theatre, and he'll watch the actor performing in the movie, and he'll say to himself, yeah, he's a good movie actor, but he's a bit of a phony because he knows he's a good actor and it's coming through in his performance and he's trying to cover it. He's a bit superficial. That's the running theme in the book, that Holden Caulfield, this 15, 16-year-old, sees everybody as a phony. So this is what, this is the theme that Mark David Chapman had, which we're told, well, according to mainstream reports, we're told that Mark David Chapman perceived John Lennon to be this phony. John Lennon had been, to his eyes, whether this is true or not, or whether he's been mind controlled to think this, or whether this is just the mainstream media pushing this narrative. I mean, he said it himself in the few interviews he's been in, that Mark David Chapman perceived John Lennon to be a phony, basically, because he'd always been, since the late 60s, early 70s especially, he'd been held up to be this peace campaigner who was out to campaign for the downtrodden man, against the establishment. And then towards 1980, and in 1980, we're told that Mark David Chapman started to read books and magazine articles about Lennon and discovered actually that John Lennon was a very wealthy man. He had lots of properties. He was living in this palatial apartment at the Dakota. And it was at that point that Mark David Chapman said to himself, this guy is a phony. He's not this peacenik.
Champagne socialist.
He's a champagne socialist. He's a phony. It's all an act. And at the same time, he started to read The Catcher in the Rye as well, with this phony kind of theme running around it. So that's what made him go and kill Lennon. I think one of the statements he made, and it might have been in court actually, he said, I wanted to push the message of Holden Caulfield and The Catcher in the Rye, this book. I wanted to make it a world-known subject, a world-known book, and to do that, I killed John Lennon in order to make that happen. That's what he said. That's one of the many things that he said. But yeah, back to Hinckley. He's kind of linked in with this book. So
you were right
loads
about
of weird...
the date, by the way, Matt. It was 30th of March. I just looked it up in 81.
It was the 30th of March.
And
right?
I've just got some photos of John Hinckley, and he looks disturbingly like Mark David Chapman. There's a definite resemblance there.
Indeed. Yes, actually, yeah. So would I be reaching it if I was to say that both these men were fostered, maybe even from birth, if not from early childhood, to become what they became, and that either one of them could have switched? It could have been Mark David Chapman that could have been picked to shoot Reagan, and it could have been Hinckley to shoot Lennon. I mean, judging by what you say, Desiree, about the Reagan thing and Mark David Chapman, and also Hinckley and him standing outside the Dakota and having books about Lennon in his room and the Catcher in the Rye, it could very possibly have been the case.
It could have been like a backup plan, if Chapman failed, then the other one would have been in place, and vice versa, or who knows how these people think or do.
So Lennon was removed just before Reagan took up his presidency, which is interesting. It was the last days of Jimmy Carter, I guess.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. December. So Reagan would have just been elected. So he would have been the president-elect, and then going into office officially January 81.
Right.
So,
and this would be the reason. This is one of the reasons that a number of researchers would say that this is one of the reasons that if it was an intel assassination, this is one of the reasons why they would have wanted Lennon taken out, because the Reagan administration, or perhaps maybe not even Reagan himself, maybe his vice president George H.W. Bush, an ex-CIA head, he was the head of the CIA in 1976. They would have perceived Lennon to have been a threat. I mean, there are cynics who you read these sort of chat forums and stuff where this kind of subject is debated and chatted about, and the cynics will say that the cynics that are against this argument, this intel assassination argument, will say, well, but Lennon, he wasn't a threat. He was just a pop singer. He was just a pop star, right? But he was the biggest star in the world. He wasn't just a pop singer. He and the Beatles together had changed culture,
right?
They weren't just musicians. I mean, back in the late 60s when he recorded "Give Peace a Chance," it became the anthem for the anti-Vietnam War movement. I think it was sung outside a protest. I can't remember what year it was, but it was sung outside the White House by thousands of people.
Right.
They didn't sing "We Shall Overcome" or any other of the older anthems. They sang "Give Peace a Chance," and that just kind of indicates the kind of power that John Lennon had.
Right, lots of influence over the younger crowd, right?
Yes.
The younger generation, and that's the ones that they seemingly at least were afraid of, because they had a huge movement going that could have easily taken out, the older mindset and the Vietnam War. They're being drafted like left and right, and people were very unhappy, and so that younger generation had a huge voice, and it was almost like John Lennon was in a lot of ways leading that movement. People were looking up to him.
He was one of the few, wasn't he?
Right.
I mean, he was one of the few well-known stars that was actually really doing it. Other artists were singing songs about it, but Lennon was actually getting engaged. And this worried Nixon at the time. Again, if you want to argue against a cynic who said, he was just a pop star, we could say, well, yeah, he was a pop star, but he was actually doing something about it. And if you look what was going on in the early 70s, especially when he came to America, and before he came to America, he was in Britain, he was doing the bed-ins. It was very much, he was campaigning, but it was more of an ideological thing. It was more talking about it and writing songs about it. But whereas when he came to the US, he got engaged with a lot of the so-called quote unquote radical protesters, the radical movement, such as the Black Panthers, and so on and so on, and the women's lib movement, and so many others. And I know we spoke about this, Mark, before. We chatted about this on the Lennon.
Trying to work out how sincere he may have been, if this was, coming from the heart, or if he was put up to it as some kind of agenda. We were really trying to make sense of all that on that show, because we just concluded that he was such an enigma, such a difficult character to understand.
But one of the things also that came out, and this was in the press at the time, back in the early 70s, John Lennon was posing the idea and kind of announcing to the public that what he wanted to do, and this was in 1971, 72. When was the election? Was it 72 when Nixon was coming up for re-election? I think it was 72 or
72 it would have been, yeah.
Yeah. Around that time, I might be wrong, but from what I remember, from what I can recall from reading various books and stuff, I think that the age of voting was going to be lowered. So there was going to be a younger demographic that was allowed to vote, which meant that, in terms of the counterculture, the so-called counterculture, people that were into rock music and fans of John Lennon, there would have been more, in terms of votes. If you wanted to sway the vote, John Lennon would have had, basically, President Nixon was worried. Okay, what was going on was John Lennon was putting it out that he was planning to do, in conjunction with these upcoming elections, what he was planning to do was to take out a US-wide concert tour, either an all-star concert tour with him being the headline, I guess, or if he couldn't get the all-stars to take place, if he couldn't get these various musicians to take part, he would then do it himself and take this concert tour around the US in order to, and then this is in his words, to radicalize the audience, to get them to engage, to get them to look at radical politics, quote unquote, radical politics. So we're talking anti-Vietnam movement, we're talking Black Panthers, we're talking Women's Lib, we're talking even Irish, the IRA, we're talking, really, really radical anti-establishment kind of issues. And one of his ideas, and again he posed this, one of his ideas was to go around the US with this concert tour thing, and in the foyer of the auditoriums and the theatres, he wanted people to turn up, say, like the Black Panthers and so on, various radical groups to turn up from these local radical groups from wherever the concert was going, to turn up and basically hand out leaflets. And this worried President Nixon. This is what got the FBI to finally, the FBI to actually monitor John Lennon and to try and throw him out of the US, because President Nixon, and this is according to people that were there at the time that have since said this, President Nixon was absolutely shit scared, because with the lowering of the voting, this opened up the voting to people who would have been into John Lennon, into the Beatles, into the anti-Vietnam, anti-President Nixon kind of...
I was just going to add in there, and who was the head of the CIA at that time? That would have been W. Bush.
That's right.
Yeah, that was in 1976.
So he was...
Yeah, I think that was a little bit
very,
later.
very much.
So if you think about the timing of this, by 1980, Lennon really wasn't much of a threat anymore, because he'd taken 5 years off to become a house husband to raise Sean. He'd just put out Double Fantasy, but it wasn't full of radical revolutionary tracks. It was just full of nice songs. And Nixon was long gone by 1980, so Lennon was nowhere near as much of a threat then as he had been earlier in the 70s. So you'd think if they'd wanted to take him out, the time to do it would have been back in the 70s, which does make me wonder how connected it was to the Reagan-Bush administration incoming, in that they left it until 1980.
Well, the thing is, what happened was, with that tour, it was that tour that got Nixon really, really scared. And what he did was, that's when the deportation proceedings against John Lennon started. They tried to deport John Lennon, and they used the excuse, and it was a flimsy excuse, because it wasn't standing up, because John Lennon fought this in court and won in the end. He won in 1975, but he kept fighting, and it was a flimsy case. Basically, there were the US deportation, the immigration service of the US was using this flimsy excuse that John Lennon had been busted for drugs in England in 1968 or 69, whenever it was, for a bit of dope. They were using that as the basis to throw him out of the US, because John Lennon wanted to stay in the US and he wanted a visa, but they were threatening to take his visa away and throw him out. And it soon transpired that it wasn't that the reason they actually wanted him to get out was because he was getting involved in all this radical politics. So he got a lawyer involved, a guy by the name of Leon Wilds. And what Leon Wilds said to John Lennon was, and by this point, the FBI started to bug John Lennon. They were